Hello, and welcome to our second in a series of discussions we call View from the Vices. My name is Troy Thomas, and I will be your host. I lead BCG's defense and security topic for North America, but have been invested in today's topic discussion for several decades, to include during my own service in the military. That topic, readiness. For our military, readiness is a national security imperative and a persistent challenge. As in our first podcast on defense innovation, we'll hear today from three BCG senior advisors who recently served as the vice chiefs of the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, and the U.S. Air Force, respectively. General Joe Martin, General Sevy Wilson, and Admiral Bill Lesher. Let's get into it. Starting with General Martin, let's begin with what readiness means in the context of your service and why it is so important.
Well, thanks, Troy. So holistic Army readiness is the Army's ability to generate highly trained, disciplined, and fit tactical units and preserve the capacity and capability to meet operational demands of the Joint Force and achieve the strategic role of rapidly providing Army forces to combatant commanders. Now, that's a lot in a definition, but Army readiness is essentially at three levels. Tactical readiness is the ability of the Army forces to fight and meet the demands of their assigned missions. The Army assesses that readiness by unit commanders assessing their mission essential task proficiency, as well as resource availability and the serviceability of the equipment that supports their formations. The Army uses what's called the sustainable readiness model to maintain ready forces and provide combatant commanders with capabilities. There's three phases to the sustainable readiness model. It's prepare, ready, and mission. And for active component units, that's a 24-month cycle. So each of those phases is 8 months. And then there's a different cycle for reserve component forces, and it's 60-month cycle. Operational readiness, just briefly, is the Army's ability to meet Joint Force global operational demands in either a campaigning or contingency environment, but not both simultaneously. And then finally, strategic readiness is the Army's ability through time and space to provide combatant commanders with trained and ready tactical units that can meet the Joint Forces demands. Now, the Army measures strategic readiness using 7 different tenets: manning, training, equipping, sustaining, installations, capacities, and capabilities. Why that's important is because the Army is expected to provide ready formations to meet global combatant commander requirements. In a peacetime environment or campaigning, that's very easy to predict. But in a contingency environment where there's some crisis in the world or worse, the Army is expected to still provide those formations. But it's got to balance, when those contingencies come up, the impact of what will happen with the tactical readiness of the units that in an unanticipated fashion had to speed up their readiness production cycle. The last thing I'll say is there's 2 types of readiness, if you will. There's current readiness that I've already talked about, but there's also future readiness. Future readiness is a modernized Army that's available to meet the needs of Joint Force commanders in a future conflict. And so the Army has to simultaneously modernize. And so that's why we created the sustainable readiness model, to create windows of opportunity for units to be employed on a mission, but also for units to prepare for missions. And then finally, for units to modernize for future missions, providing predictability to commanders as they prepare for the various missions that they have.
So Troy and Joe, when I hear you talk, I look through a lens that says, for the Air Force, for many years, for the past decade, readiness was synonymous with availability. We looked at largely a measure of military units and their ability to immediately respond to fight tonight. And capacity and capability took on a lesser role in how we thought about it. And so, Joe, as you just talked about, I think that's one of the challenges we face is, we have to look through the lens of ready for what, and then ready when. And then we've been focused on the first piece of that, the availability to fight tonight, not I need a force that's available to fight a peer adversary in this time frame. And so the modernization piece has taken on I think, a lesser role that I think we need to change that paradigm for.
Yeah, Sev, if I were to pitch in from a Navy perspective, I think Joe covered the terrain quite well. Each service talks about readiness from a strategic perspective, largely at the service level, operational formation level, tactical unit level. And I think a really strong construct for thinking about it that touches, in some respects, on each of those levels is the construct in which the Joint Staff, working with the services, assesses forces demanded by the COCOMs against the forces supplied by the services, and they track that, in the directed readiness tables. It really illuminates, certainly for the Navy, many of the most significant challenges across units such as carriers, submarines, large surface combatants, the other services, BCTs, fires battalions, fighter squadrons, and the like. And it also touches, as Joe hinted at, some of the broader elements of the discussion. At the strategic level, the Navy tracks readiness, investment and performance in personnel, equipment, supply, training, ordnance, networks, infrastructure. I think one of the things, as we talk about why readiness is important and why it's challenging, is certainly in the Navy, and my perspective from Joint Staff Service, I believe each of the services struggles with a force generation process, the pump, optimized fleet response plan in the Navy. 36-month cycle for most units that spans maintenance, basic, integrated, deploy, and sustain phases, that has not performed at theoretical level in terms of a 36-month cycle. And really each of the services in terms of the force generation pump has been challenged to have those operate at the designed intent. I think that's certainly what I'd like to talk a bit about the future. But one of the things we talked about, what is readiness? And there was also some thought about, hey, why is it important? So I have a few thoughts on it, but I think I'd pitch it back to Joe or Sevi. Any particular thoughts on why readiness is particularly important right now?
Well, one of the biggest problems, and I know it's going to be a challenge, is the ever-changing geostrategic environment surrounding the Army. And when things change, that decreases predictability. And it takes time to produce readiness, proper readiness. I'll use one of our 58 brigade combat teams as an example, an armored brigade combat team. For that formation to properly execute its mission, they've got to be well-trained collectively on 745 collective tasks at echelon and over 5,000 individual tasks across the formation and 160 military occupational specialties. That takes time to build that proficiency. And when there's not predictability, that's when commanders have to make decisions on how they're going to prioritize their time and their resources to do that. In some cases, they can build the proficiency, but then they can't invest the time in maintaining their platforms so their platforms are serviceable and ready for that next requirement. So that's why readiness is so important. That challenge underscores the importance of why we've got to have time and predictability for our formations.
Hey, Joe, and I'll pitch in on that. As I started earlier, our current fixation on current force availability is a challenge, because if we fail to adapt and modernize fast enough, which all the services are trying to do, all the wargaming suggests that the outcome is mission failure. So, we across, I think, all the services have been trying to look at how we accelerate those changes we need and how do we modernize the capabilities relevant to the adversary that is primary in our horizon. So unless we're modernized to be able to fight that against that adversary, the outcome is in doubt, which we don't want to have. So that's the tension, because the current, the COCOMs today are going to continue to have a demand signal on the services for the capability that's ready and available today. And yet, at the same time, the services are responsible to modernize the force to be able to have the capability to fight in the future. And so that whole framework, I think, is the challenge. And if we get it wrong, the outcome is the overall outcome is in doubt.
Yes, Sevi, that really resonates. I think each of the services has testified before hearings and articulated in vision documents, prioritization of readiness, lethality / modernization, and then capacity. And not all stakeholders see it that way. But I think, the service chiefs are pretty aligned on readiness and lethality, i.e. modernization, are table stakes for any capacity we buy. And therefore it's misguided to be thinking to invest heavily in capacity at the expense of readiness and lethality, because that's a losing proposition. The importance, again, I'm with Joe, the security environment's as challenging now as I think as any we've seen. 2 autocratic nuclear armed rivals, the conflicts in Ukraine and Israel, coercive activities in China. So certainly the Navy messaging is readiness is key and important because it is core to credible deterrence and being able to find when should deterrence fail. I think it's also an aspect of why it's really important is because it's hard. When we create readiness, it's scarce, limited, perishable commodity. And so for leaders to really focus on what it means to generate it, it puts a premium on ability to execute our force generation pumps, our readiness processes. And also, as Sevi, you were just talking about, it puts a premium on making well-informed and transparent decisions on how we're going to consume that readiness, both geographically and temporally as well. One of the things that, I've kind of observed in a lot of the conversations, particularly in the DC arena, is that it's centered so often on this idea of capacity or often on crafting the latest update to our strategy. And certainly what I've seen in the Navy, that what is most impactful in this decade of concern, in the Davidson window of 2027, the actions that are most impactful into that have to do with improving force generation execution in major ways, not in marginal ways, as most consequential to near-term warfighting impact. When you look at the strategic ambition of the Navy, you can see the imperative execution because our strategic ambition is bounded in many key dimensions by ability to execute, even beyond readiness. So when people talk about a 355-ship Navy, our industrial base ability to deliver new ships, submarines not delivering that on their scheduled timeline, CVN centers, large service combatants. In readiness, our repair industrial base ability to repair and sustain the fleet we have is seeing weak execution, or our ability to recruit the larger force as well. So this is really what has led, I think, the Navy to focus in particular on improving execution in the near term, and in particular key elements of our force generation processes as most consequential. And again, Sebi, as you say, that challenge is always to then properly balance that with investments in future readiness and capability overmatch. So in terms of, what are the most significant challenges, Joe mentioned one, which is predictability. What other ones come to mind from your guys' perspective?
Yeah, predictability is certainly one of it. I come back to, the analytical framework of how we do this, how we integrate elements that affect both, that look at current readiness, effects across the commands, what's our future availability and readiness, what are our modernization efforts, and how we keep those in balance. And again, I come back to looking through the lens of, ready for what, ready when, and what's the the mission set that we need to be ready for. And so here's a real easy example, right? So if we were to all look through the lens of if we had to be ready for a Middle Eastern violent extremist fight, we would all say, our services have that both availability and capacity to do that. If we were then to turn the lens and say, how about if I said now, rather than a violent extremist fight, we have to be ready for a nuclear armed peer adversary, right? So that same equipment that we have to be able to fight in that case isn't going to work, right? I have to have new modernized equipment against a modern threat and a capable adversary. And so that's where this tension always arises, where I've got to have enough today to meet the current challenges that exist globally across the planet. But also I've got to be in the backdrop of that, preparing the force and all the things that Joe, that you've talked about, but for a peer adversary and both the capacity and the capability to do that. And to me, that's the thing that kept us all working together to try and figure out how do we do this and what's the analytical framework we look through, and then how do we assess that. And then we haven't even talked about yet is if we don't do that, where's the risk and risk to who? and whom is the risk put on, and how do we mitigate that risk?
Yeah, pulling on a thread that you pulled on, Sevi, the capacity to meet globally integrated base plans for combatant commanders. How do we do that? I mean, just to use simple math on what I'd previously described in terms of the sustainable readiness model, and there being 58 brigade combat teams in the Army. There's hundreds more brigades. They're functional, multifunctional, but for those BCTs, those are the pacing item. And given the cycles that I described previously, that means that at any given time, there's 15 brigades that are ready for a mission. There can be more, but their readiness and the serviceability of their equipment will be in question based on where they are in the cycle. And that's where commanders have to underwrite the risk associated with speeding up that process. And without getting into numbers, I can tell you that the globally integrated base plans demand much more than those 15 that I described just at that moment. But here's some other things that are challenges I think that we need to face. And some of them are current, some of them are future, but I'll call it strategic depth. Okay, what do I mean by that? I think it was Bill or Sevi talked about the capacity of our organic industrial base to meet the requirements of a force that is in much higher demand and obviously working much harder and faster than it did before. Strategic depth is important. And it's not just the capacity of the depot, but it's anticipating the additional supply chain requirements it'll need to meet that increased demand. That takes a lot of analytical rigor to be able to understand that. And then you've got to determine whether or not you can invest appropriately to meet that demand. And if you can't, then can your supply chain respond if there are additional resources to meet that demand? For the Army in particular, something else that's very important is maintaining our pre-positioned equipment and ammunition, the magazine stocks, to support contingencies, not just current operations. And when you see some of the things that have happened with the PDA, the Presidential Drawdown Authority, and other FMS requirements that are emerging or have been consistent, those all place demands on the defense industrial base and the organic industrial base. Something else that the Army is wrestling with is aging mobilization and deployment infrastructure. I can tell you that the Army's in the process of modernizing its organic industrial base. That's a $15 billion investment. And then the deployment base, think the camps, posts, and stations, the rail networks that connect them to ports and the port capacity. Those are all investments that the Army's got to make. And that's about a $15 billion future requirement as well. Bill already talked about manpower to man our formations. If we can't recruit to need, we don't have formations that have the manpower to be able to meet the strategic depth necessary for a large-scale crisis. And the last point I'll bring up, and it's a challenge, is increasing the capabilities and the capacities of our allies and partners. Why is that important? Because a strong alliance, a strong partnership creates a more credible threat and ability to deter against aggression, no matter where you're talking about. Over to you guys.
Hey, Joe, I'll pick up on one of the things you said, and it struck me that, again, one of these challenges is I think all the services are kind of handcuffed in this fight tonight perspective that puts the onus right now on this current wheel that you talked about that's flying with the brigade combat teams and squadrons and stuff doing, and yet that fights against the time and the resources needed to modernize all the things you talked about on the back end. And how do I get the forces trained with the infrastructure in place to do that are challenged by this fight tonight perspective. And again, so what we always saw, this natural tension between the combatant commands and the services on the world and the risks that they saw them. And then it goes back to this risk and, who owns that risk and when should they own it? Again, that's we could probably have a long conversation just on that, because there's a risk. They look at there's short term, there's long term risk. There's probably help that we could learn from other folks on how they assess risk and the lens they look through this. And there's a temporal aspect to that risk that I think we need to take into perspective.
Yeah, all those points really resonate as well in terms of, again, why is this hard? What are the challenges? We certainly see the same issues with op-tempo today, oversubscribing our capability to generate forces. And so that's leading to short-term fixes, substitute processes, deferred maintenance, all at the expense of really this longer-term view, what it takes to create a healthy major fight level of readiness for sure. And this fiscal tension, Sevi, you're talking about, we see for sure because keeping a global fight tonight ready force is expensive. And if you look at, I've often, compared and contrasted with what certain of our adversaries and or competitors look at. So if they imagine they own the initiative in this fight, it's a different construct, right, than having to maintain global fight tonight level of readiness. You tailor the readiness to when you think the fight's going down. But, Roger, that's the case, and that's the situation we're in. And that's what that also puts a premium, as you highlight, Sevi, on this idea of allocating risk, prioritizing, which are key as well. It again leads, that is the kind of thinking that led the Navy to really focus on improving the performance of OFRP, the optimized fleet response plan. And so there's specific elements of that have been stagnant for long periods of time. Our public shipyard repair performance, private shipyard repair performance, aviation depot performance. And as we transition today, what are the opportunities now to really make a difference here, to really significantly improve our ability to sustain, to generate ready forces? My perspective is that there's an opportunity to bring a strong continuous improvement process to address the most significant constraints in our force generation process. We learned that in our enterprises, the naval aviation enterprise, surface warfare enterprise, the undersea enterprise, exceptionally strong type commanders working with our system commanders to improve the process. Often, nonetheless, our traditional culture and behavior was not helpful to us, specifically in terms of a focus on, when we were, for example, at 250 ready F-18s for a decade, the self-talk of our enterprise was, hey, sequestration is killing us. We really need more inputs, more resources. And when we got serious about looking at what world-class performance looks like in many of the fourth generation processes, we saw that there were other elements that were constraining it. And so our culture of emphasizing green up echelon, fixing within, impressed with scope of activity are things we attacked. And I would say most consequentially what we attacked was this interesting difference from how we command and control force employment with clear unity of command and supporting alignment. And when I look, and I think the other services as well, as many of our complex cross-functional readiness generation outcomes, it's generally work done by committee. Let's rally around. In our case, we have, the SysCom, the systems command commander, the type commander, the supply chief, working as a committee. And I would just highlight in terms of opportunities, this is the journey that was really the origin story of the Navy's Get Real, Get Better cultural transformation, about bringing clear supporting ownership and accountability to how we work this, to change our behavior from kind of hey, we embrace the green. And as a quick side note, when we were at 55% mission capable with triple digit down F-18s in 2018, many of NAVAIR Syscoms and NAV Supply Command, Systems Command metrics were green. And we're like, well, how can that be? And it was because we didn't have this alignment and this strong focus and accountability. What's our baseline performance? What's our North Star? In this case, it was 80% mission capable, 341 jets, and then test our self-talk with gap closure. So I'll broaden it over to the group, but I would highlight in terms of opportunities to attacking specific constraints in operating our force generation processes at the highest level. Culture and scoping our improvement for velocity learning were two elements that we saw and really led to changes, productive changes in leadership behavior, problem-solving approaches, and the way we collaborate.
I think, today we can also look at an opportunity to use big data, machine learning, and AI to help build models that can accurately reflect much of what you talked about. Because I do think we need that holistic model and a new model today based on the world that we live in to look at readiness. Good, rigorous analytic model that will help us determine the risk and then to be able to put the appropriate resources behind that.
Yeah, I'll add 3 points quickly. And Sevi and Bill, you both spoke somewhat to this, but Is there perhaps a methodology to flexibly sync our modernization funding and readiness environments in an ever-changing environment? The answer is I don't know, but that big data would help us with that, so that we're delivering capabilities for modernizing our forces on a timeline that matches with the readiness cycling and requirements that we have. Second thing, I think the defense industrial base and the organic industrial base could improve upon their capabilities and readiness to meet current and future requirements. So what does that look like? It's taking a hard look at our depots across the board and making sure that they're modernized, making sure that they're efficient and effective, and they have strategic depth necessary to expand if necessary. And then finally, prioritization of installation port and OIB investments, I think improving upon that so that we're attacking the most critical target first with the resources to modernize it, and then continuing down that prioritization line for any other installation that's got a gap that needs to be filled over time. That's something you can't do overnight, but you need to spend your first dollar in the most important place first.
Yeah, it makes sense, Joe. In the broader context, I would say so we talked about why it's important, what are the challenges, some of the opportunities. I also find myself encouraged nonetheless by some of the progress and some of the other developments in this space. That 5-year journey in naval aviation from 2018 at 55% mission capable to 2019, 80% sustained sense. When you look at naval aviation today, it's never been more ready or lethal. When you look at specific measures of the mission capable aircraft required metrics, full mission capable aircraft required, and it's a proven construct that I think we can more broadly address other elements. It's made a difference in the private shipyards, and we're looking to bring it to the public shipyards. So there is elements where we can see we're gaining traction, and we're able to move the needle on long stagnant elements of force generation, design, and readiness. And Joe, I would really echo your point, because I think these lessons have both get better, and other learning mindset approaches, I believe, clearly can be embraced by your industrial-based partners to, again, look to bring world-class performance, which is our target. That's the Navy's North Star, in force generation. And by world-class, I don't mean military. I mean of all elements of these type of processes, logistics and supply chain, et cetera. I think there's opportunities for our industrial base to join us in that journey to world-class performance. And the other thing I would highlight really is, I think, my final comment, it ties back a bit to our prior podcast, I think, on innovation in some interesting ways. We talked about how innovation was benefiting from some very nascent cultural change as elements of disruptive capability office, the AFWorks, the Futures Command was showing a way to think, act, operate differently. And I think, at least in the Navy, I see elements of a culture change taking root as well. And the other element from that last podcast, as we see different types of innovation that can potentially change our key force structure elements, that brings different thoughts about readiness construct, particularly when we are talking about some element of our force being low cost, easily manufactured, attritable systems that don't require extensive repair infrastructure. And so, again, this space, like all of the space, is dynamic, but with clear opportunities for leaders to dig in, move the needle, and make us better.
Yeah, we did a really good job of wrapping that up. That I think real positive. I just close with one other part. I think there's I mentioned a couple times, we've all kind of talked about risk. One of those areas I think we can learn from is from the business and financial sectors who also look at risk in a different way, that we can probably do some learning from and help potentially change our views of how we're looking at the problem.
Gentlemen, a very rich conversation. Admiral Lesher, I think you synthesized a lot of the strategic thinking that was introduced here well. I appreciate that we thought about readiness in a strategic way with all of its complexity, and not just simply reducing it to platform availability, although that's a key part of it. I think we also understand that it is a persistent and ever-evolving challenge. It requires engaged leadership. It requires continuous improvement. And as you mentioned, building off our last podcast, it requires a lot of innovation. This is not a static target. It is a dynamic target. and it deserves the amount of intellectual thought, leadership, planning, analysis, everything that goes into it every day within our services, both here in the U.S., but also with our allies and partners. So great conversation. I think General Wilson, Sevi, you've teed up a nice topic for a future podcast on risk. And we're really looking forward to continuing the conversation with all three of our vices in the months ahead. Thank you.